Mind coach. No sweat. Yeah. Whew. Yeah. I just be talking that good. Still they gon' say that I'm bad. Yeah. We gon' go clean up the hood. I'm about to give them my last. Soon as they look at the presents, they wanna bring up my past. Yeah. We be exposing them liars. I'm about to put them on blast. I will not apologize for it. I will not apologize for it. I just be talking that good. Still they gon' say that I'm bad. Yeah, we gon' go clean up the hood. Mind coach. No sweat. Yeah. Whew. Yeah. I just be talking that good. Still they gon' say that I'm bad. Yeah. We gon' go clean up the hood. I'm about to give them my last. Soon as they look at the presents, they wanna bring up my past. Yeah. We be exposing them liars. I'm about to put them on blast. I will not apologize for it. I will not apologize for it. I just be talking that good. Still they gon' say that I'm bad. Yeah, we gon' go clean up the hood.
Hour. Shalom, family. Again, peace and blessings to you, Brother Pascal. Free spirit. Again, you are a blessing to our nation, to our people. Just want to let you know that from me to you, from the Most High. Let's get it, family. We're going to deal with a little bit of information today. Every now and then they try to recycle these arguments in the unconscious community to really attack the Bible, to really attack scripture. And that's fine if they really want to do that, but let's keep it in the context of truth, right? Let's keep it in the context of truth of what it actually says. So I had a brief discussion earlier today with Chris Harris, MVP Harris, as he likes to call himself. Shout out to Chris Harris and a few of the brothers he had on his panel. Speaking on the topic of slavery, shadow slavery in the Bible. Y'all put a one in the chat for those who are listening. Just put a one in the chat. Just let me know you can hear me. I'm going to get right into this presentation real quick. I want to make sure. I want to make sure that you guys are good. Appreciate your free spirit. Appreciate you, sis. And I just want to go over some of this information. I've had this debate before. And it comes down to an issue of understanding cultural context, right? Of certain of the Israelite culture and what the Bible is speaking about in its particular day and time. The difficulty for some people is how you translate what we read in the Bible during its time, written during its time periods, and the thing that it deals with. How do we translate that information? How do we translate that law, that code of morality? How do we translate what the prophets taught in the biblical narrative, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, especially? How do we translate that to our everyday lives and modern living today, right? How do we deal with these trigger words, the issues? We have to admit, as a people, the word slave in and of itself is a trigger word for us. It's simply what it is. It's a trigger word. And so oftentimes when our people hear that word, we spaz out, right? But watch this. They talk about and try to demonize the Bible, right? Because it deals with the concept of slavery, right? But in every culture, ancient culture, and even today, modern day living, there still exists an institution of slavery. So what is it that we have to do with that information? What is the scripture telling us about the institution of slavery and how we should deal with the institution of slavery and this whole argument, right? Because the question is, does the Bible condone slavery? Does it condone chattel slavery? And the answer to that question is no. Unequivocally no. Is there references and is there recordings or recordations of slavery in the Bible? Yes. And for people who like to say, oh, simply the Bible is just a comic book, it's not historical, well, that's false. Because oftentimes the things that people criticize the Bible about is strictly about the historical events and evidences and cultures that it actually speaks to. And it actually speaks to a culture of slavery. Now, if you understand the material culture concerning Israel and the Israelites, they weren't shielded from that. That would be fallacious. That would be fiction. That would be complete fiction. But because Israel speaks about it in a way, then we have to understand that. Hold on one second for me, family. Yeah, Shalakia, I had to take that call. One of my brothers. So again, I want to get into this presentation in dealing with shadow slavery in the Bible, or does the Bible condone it? Now, like I said, I've had this discussion before. And I don't mind having it again because I think it's necessary. What I'm going to do after I go through this, just for a select few, I'm going to drop the link to come on in, just in case. But let's have this discussion, right? So let's deal with it. Let me share my screen. Let me share my screen really quickly. All right, and let me see if I'm sharing my screen. Just let me make sure that you guys can see it clearly here. And then we're going to get into this. right? Want to make sure you guys can see it. Let me go back. I think we got it there. Yeah, I think we got it there. So let's go into dealing with, does the Bible condone chattel slavery? Right? And we sort of have to really get into this and really sort of break this thing down, because they try to take this thing in so many different directions. And not dealing honestly about the cultural context, right? And we're going to get into this. So, number one, is there evidence of slavery in the Bible? Yes. Is there evidence of Israelites participating in a slave system in the Bible? The answer again is yes. But what does that institution look like? Now, people will say, well, what does it matter? Well, it matters a lot, right? Because are we talking about slavery in the same context as we would in the antebellum South? Are we talking about the same type of slavery as we see the Egyptians oppress the Israelites? Are we talking about the same system of slavery? No, we're not. What we're talking about is an institution of class, basically. This is really an institution of class. And when we talk about these different things, we have to understand completely what it is that the scripture is trying to convey, right? So let me get into that. Let's get in here, right? Let's see what it's doing here. So we're talking about getting the terminology straight. And that's one thing we need to do, right, with these people. Let's get the terminology straight. A major cause of confusion for contemporary readers is the assumption that the word slave, as it is found in the Old Testament legal passages, right, meant the same thing in ancient Israel as it does for us today. The Old Testament was written in classical Hebrew, and so it is not surprising that certain words do not have perfect equivalents in modern English. And I was trying to explain that to a group of young brothers on Chris Harris's panel today, that we have to understand that when we're reading the King James Version Bible or the English Bible, the English written Bibles, that these are simply translations, and that that the Hebrew Bible doesn't always give us a modern equivalent in English to speak directly to the culture of the Old Testament and what the Israelites were doing during that particular time. We don't get an equivalence of the cultural context based on the translation of the English wording that we see today in the KJV Bible, right? So the difficulty felt by Bible translators in rendering the Hebrew terms relating to slavery is fairly well publicized. This is what I mean about how they don't study when they make these arguments. There was a linguistic and a scholastic argument about how to properly translate the term slave from the Old Hebrew text into the modern English text. When they were translating the English Standard Bibles. The English language was difficult for them to translate things properly according to the context in which the original writers of the Hebrew Bible had written it and given it. Here's my source on that. The preface of the English Standard Version, for example, notes with respect to both the Hebrew term ebed, E-B-E-D, and the Greek term doulos, D-O-U-L-O-S. Chris Harris brought up the Septuagint to try to make this argument today earlier. The Greek term doulos would have been equivalent to the word slave. The Hebrew term abed would have been the closest they could. The Greek word doulos would have been the closest they could find to the equivalency of the cultural understanding of the Hebrew term ebed, right? A particular difficulty is presented when words in biblical Hebrew and Greek refer to ancient practices and institutions that do not correspond directly to those in the modern world. Let me read this source for you guys again, right? And how I like to set up my presentations, because people often ask me that with the information that I give and present. I try to load my presentations with bullets against the talking points of those who will criticize the Old Testament scriptures specifically, right? And the reason why I focus more on the old rendering and understanding of the Old Testament scriptures than people who attest to the New Testament is because there was no New Testament during the time of Christ, right? Or Yahweh Shai. There was no New Testament. So the only truth, if you claim he was speaking the truth, the only truth he could have relied on would have been Old Testament scripture. Shout out to you again. Peace and blessings to Yerim Yahoo. Glad to see you back, brother. Shout out to you, Christopher Howard. Shout out to you, KOT. Shout out to you, KOT. Glad to see you, brother. But understand, there has always been an argument by the translators, the English translators, who's translating from the old Hebrew text and even the Septuagint. Their translations has always been difficult when translating and dealing with the term slave. Why? Because there's no word in the English language, there's no word in the Greek language that clearly gives you an equivalent definition or understanding of the word ebed in the cultural context of the Hebrew scripture. It's simple. It's simple. But it's very difficult on these platforms we go on, right? And shout out to my brother, More, my teacher, Anonymous Hebrew. I call him my teacher. He don't like for me to say that, but I call him my teacher, Anonymous Hebrew. When we always see people throw around these terms, he's the champ here and he's the champ there. This is the MVP over here, and this is the champ of the HOK over there. Well, how do you really call yourself a champ when you only fight in your ring? How would any in the NBA or NFL, how can you really call someone a champion when they only fight if they have home field advantage? They only come out. They only stick their head out of their shell when they feel they have home field advantage. When the crowd is behind them, the arena is theirs, their locker room is theirs, right? The host is on their side, but you're calling yourself the champ, but you won't take no away games. What NBA team can call themselves a champ if they win all their home team games, but they lose their away games? How you calling yourself a champ or a champion? How are you calling yourself an MVP? Huh? How are you doing that? How is that happening? How is that happening? It's a joke. It's a joke. Everybody gets cheers and claps when they at home. How many professional athletes you only know can call themselves champion and all they won is a home and all they play is home games? It's nuts. So I don't even feed it into that foolishness. Jabari, if Sarnetta want to call you the champion over at the HOK, go ahead. But you ain't taking no away games. No away games. Chris Harris, you want to call yourself the MVP, go right ahead, but you ain't taking no away games. You ain't sticking your head outside of those platforms and taking no debates. You ain't taking no challenges. This is a joke. But let's get into it, right? Let's get to the information. You're still getting this information straight. Strictly speaking, the Old Testament does not call an individual bound to the service of another a slave. It's just simple as that. Simple as that. It calls him an Ibed, pronounced Ived. And I brought this out to Chris Harris on his show earlier. He said, oh, it's not Ibed, it's Ived. No, it's pronounced Ived, but you spell it Ebed. If we're translating to the English, you spell it E-B-E-D, right? This is where we say Obed Edom, right? It's the same terminology. It's the same word in the scripture. So let's continue. It says, and a woman in such a role is called a what? An Amma. An Amma. While these terms can connote very harsh slavery, comparable to that which was found in the antebellum South, the Hebrews as Egyptian slaves, that's the only concept we would have. That's the only equivalent we can use it is in that concept, right? When we're talking about how the Egyptians oppressed the Hebrews, that's the only way we can use that terminology to correlate a direct equivalency to how we would see chattel slavery done in the Americas. Only in the context of the Hebrews being oppressed by the Egyptians, right? But those terms often does not, as in the case in most of the words appearances in the so-called Old Testament slave laws, right? It doesn't use it in that way of determining chattel slavery or defining chattel slavery. It doesn't work that way. The most that can be said about in general about these two terms, especially the first, is that they are used to denote a social class that is relatively lower than another. This is what the Bible is teaching us when it gives us these different terminologies for an Ibed. It's more so dealing with the social order, not an institution of slavery, as we saw in the Egyptians dealing with oppressing the Israelites, as we've seen in the antebellum South. When we're talking about slavery in the terms of the Israelite paradigm in the Old Testament, it's dealing with more of a social order, a social class. And we often have these folks come on here to strictly criticize the Bible, to make false claims that the Bible supports or condones slavery. It does not. I said this also early on Chris Harris's channel, that if you actually study what the Bible talks about in the Old Testament, in the so-called slave laws in the Bible, right, which is really a poor terminology, a translation. But when you look at it, it's really dismantling the institution of what you've seen, how slavery was practiced in the ancient Near East, in ancient Kemet, and anywhere else, among the Assyrians and anywhere else during this particular time when the biblical narrative was being written. It's a complete 180 from those lively institutions of slavery. It does a complete 180. So for people to try and make the correlation, the comparison, the false argument, and play on the emotions and the appeal to the emotions of people using slave or slavery as a trigger word for us Africans, for us, those who consider ourselves African descendants of slaves, to use that as a way to manipulate your emotions and your feelings about the word because you see it written in the Bible in English, in an English translation, to try to use that is deceptive. And it's a false argument. It's a very bad argument because what they don't do is go into the material culture. The material culture clearly shows us that the Israelites dealt with a system of social class order, not chattel slavery. It's simple, and it's not even hard to go into the information and pull it out. You just got to be honest about what you're hearing and what you're reading. Let's go down here to the next one. Let me read this. Thus it is common in the Old Testament speech for people to refer to themselves as your servant. In the Hebrew is abdeke or abdeka. When addressing someone submissively. If you're not seeing these terms being used in these so-called slave laws, especially if Chris Harris tried to go into Leviticus and deal with this in this matter, right? If you're not seeing that Hebrew term being used, then you're not talking about total submission. When you see the word slaves being used in different contexts throughout the Old Testament, right? It says it is common in Old Testament speech for people to refer to themselves as your servant when addressing someone submissively. It was a sign of respect. Let's continue. And I try to give things so that hopefully people can glean from it and use to battle back when y'all hear this stuff being spewed across the unconscious community. Y'all can use what I have and what I've compiled to use it as a reference to go back and say, nope, there's another argument to that. Prove what you said here. Use it as a source of reference. Chris Harris debated me in the last debate I had with Chris Harris on Sinetta's show. He said I brought too many sources to the debate. He called it ambush scholarship because I had too many sources. He couldn't address them all. Well, that's fine. Address one. Address one of the sources. I didn't ask you to address them all. Just address one. So let's continue. Common faulty premises, right? Hasty generalizations. And I don't know why the other day I was trying to say this and I couldn't get it. Hasty generalizations, right? Also known as an argument from small numbers, statistics of small numbers, insufficient statistics, argument by generalization, faulty generalization, hasty induction, inductive generalizations, insufficient samples, lonely fact fallacies, overgenerality, overgeneralizations, unrepresentative samples. This is what you often hear in these guys' arguments. You often hear these guys in this, especially these Christian apologists, right? I had a discussion with G-Man on Sonetta channel the other day, and his argument was full of hasty generalizations. And my point was to him is, how are you generalizing all Israelites, all Hebrews? You don't know all Hebrews. You don't know all Israelites. You don't know who keeps the law, who doesn't keep the law. You don't know what practice, who keeps the Sabbath, who doesn't keep the Sabbath. You know none of that. These are bad arguments that they make often over and over and over again in this community, this unconscious community of people. They often make these bad, fallacious arguments. Look that up and study that. That reference is P.J. Hurley, 2011, A Concise Introduction to Logic. Like, listen to what they do all the time, especially with these faulty generalizations. They compare something that has no equivalence to what they're arguing against in the scripture. And they try to mesh it all together and they say, see, it's all the same. No, it's not all the same. And they do this with this slavery argument in the Bible. It's an overgenerality, overgeneralization. It's poor. It's a very poor argument. Oh, let me get that real quick before I lose my power. It's a very poor argument. Let's go down to the next slide. We're talking about, does the Bible condone chattel slavery? Right? Let me deal with this real quick. All right. It says the government set forth in this lecture proving the Bible does not condone chattel slavery. Right? So let's talk about that, right? As far back in history as can be traced, slavery has existed in some form. Right? Chris Harris did agree with me on this on this statement that I made earlier. There's not one group, and I'm not saying this to give a pass to any type of slavery. That in and of itself is immoral. The Bible teaches that. I'll prove that shortly. Slavery in and of itself, right, mass and immoral stance, a reality. So I'm not condoning slavery in any event, in any way, form, or fashion. But the issue is that slavery as we know it today, and as we know it has been practiced, as I stated earlier, in many other cultures, is not what you see in the Bible, in the biblical narrative concerning the Israelites. You see it do the Egyptian oppression of Israel, the Assyrians oppression of Israel, the Persian oppression of Israel, the Babylonian oppression of Israel. We see it. We see it. But do we see that specific practices, those same practices, being done in ancient Israel? We don't see that. We don't see that. Let's continue. It says slaves in this context have no personal freedom. When we talk about slavery, right? Let's read this. Chattel slavery, or owning of human beings as property able to be bought, sold, given, and inherited, is perhaps the best known form of slavery. Agreed. Slaves in this context have no personal freedom or recognized rights to decide the direction of their own lives. So in many of these well-known or historical aspects of slavery, you have no personal rights. You have no personal rights. You have no human rights. You have no personal freedoms. You have no way to direct your own lives. You have no freedom of speech. You have no right to bear arms. You don't have any right to own land. You don't have any rights to wealth. Your basic needs of survival in all institutions of slavery is based on what the slave master or the oppressor gives you. Simple as that. You have no rights. You're not treated as a human being. You're treated as chattel or cattle. Like pigs in a pen. They throw you slop to eat. Like cows. They throw you hay and take you and you're fed off the grass. But you have no human rights. You have no legal, and this is the biggest point. You have no rights to legal retribution. You have no standing rights in the court system. This is made plain in historical understanding with President Adams when he took on the case of the slaves of the Amistad. The only reason why he was able to win that case because there was no precedent for maritime law. What is maritime law? How slaves are governed over the seas. Who and what they belong to over the seas. And that there were parameters put in place about how people could be taken from certain areas and then sold overseas on the actual waters. So he won that case based on maritime law. People really don't have that understanding. So the people on Amistad, had they actually been bought over on some other ship on a legal way of slavery and bought over to the Americas, they would have still been slaves. But because what happened occurred on the sea, there was really no precedent to hold them to an American court system. Slaves don't have legal precedents. You can't show me that in ancient Kemet. You can't show me that with the ancient Assyrians. You can't show me that with the Persians, the Babylonians. You can't show me that. Even in the antebellum South, very few, if no legal rights at all. So when these equivalents are being made to what we see in the biblical narrative about slavery, we'll see that those who being termed as slaves in the English translations, but we know is a false equivalent, is a poor equivalency by the use of that word slave. The difference between an Ebed or Eved in the biblical narrative as concerning the Israelites, you will see that they had legal rights. They had rights to legal retribution. They could not be treated any kind of a way. They had basic human rights. So to continue to try to make this argument against the understanding of what a servant was or a slave was in the Bible and say, look, it's the same everywhere. It's all, no, it was not. It was a complete 180-degree turn from what we saw practiced in the ancient Near East. Stay away from these false arguments that they make, right? So oftentimes, again, my claim and warrant is that many modern readers of the Bible attempt to equate modern notions of slavery with the forms of slavery practiced in the ancient Near East. Now let's get into it. The Bible does not condone chattel slavery. Old Testament Israelite regulations free slaves every 7th year. That's Exodus chapter 21, verse 2. They commanded the death penalty for man stealing. Now, this is a big dagger to this whole argument that they try to push this narrative that Israelite slavery is bad. Israelites owning slaves was just as bad or the same as everything else. Well, let's look at what they're talking about here. Why is there a death penalty in Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, regarding man stealing? Huh? Let's get that real quick. Let's read that. Exodus 21. Let me get that real quick. Exodus 21 and 16. Let's read that. And let me get that in the, let me see if I can get it in the, I want to get that in the blue letter so y'all can see real quick. So we can get that real quick. Here we go. Let's look at this, family. Right? This is Exodus 21. And we're going to go down to verse 16. It says, and he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. This is a strict prohibition against man stealing. Let's look. I'm going to go back in here, right? And he that stealeth, let's go here, right? Ganab, right? What is that? To steal, to steal away, to carry away, right? Brought, to steal, to be stolen, to steal away, to be stolen away, to be bought by stealth. Isn't that what the Europeans were doing? Isn't that what the Egyptians were doing? We have ancient steles and papyri that talk about how Pharaoh Sobekneferu would go and steal Nubians and Libyans for the sole purpose of slave labor. And Sobekneferu would clearly say, listen, my forefathers did this. This is what we've always been doing, going down and stealing Nubians and Libyans to come back for our building projects. It's slaves when they needed another workforce. And I won't even go into that. I'll deal with the corvée system, which is what Jabari and others like to talk about. Well, see, no, they were being paid. Well, the corvée system was completely different from those who were actual slaves in ancient Kemet. The corvée system, they would draft you for 3 to 6 months at a time, and you would go work on the building project. And while you were away from your family, they would give you a wage that you could send back to them to support them. That's called corvée. But what happens if you didn't answer that call? If you didn't answer that draft, you know what they would do? Then they would come and get your whole family, your wife, your grandmother, your grandfather, your children. They would come and get your whole family and force you to work with no pay. You would then become a slave. You would then become a slave in ancient Kemet. So we know how these practices work. But here we see there's a complete prohibition against man stealing, right? To steal, to take away by theft, secretly. We know this is clearly what the Europeans practice, what the Portuguese practice to a degree. We know what the Dutch practice. We know what the British practice. We know what the Americans practice. They would come into that land by stealth a lot of times, by night. And they would steal you away. They would steal you away. But why does the Bible have a prohibition against that? A prohibition against it? Because it was not to be done in all of Israel, and generally sought to limit the institution and protection of the slave. Further, non-chattel slavery was generally not organized by race, but by circumstance and economics. That's another dagger to this whole argument about they don't understand that this is dealing with social class and social order. It has nothing to do with race. But they know that us as black folks here in America, that word slave is a trigger word for us. And we immediately get emotional when we hear it. We have to stop allowing them to make these false arguments. I don't care if you don't hit the panels, you don't debate. Take this information, put it in the chat. They might block you. They block most of y'all anyway. Stop letting them run wild with these lies. Because the moment y'all start standing up to them in this foolishness and these lies that they be spewing, they'll back off. And then you'll see they really don't have anything to talk about. I'm going to just be 1,000 with you. They really don't have anything to talk about. That's why they always bashing the Bible, because they ain't got nothing to talk about. They're not studying nothing else. They're not reading nothing else. They got many of them just got a personal grudge against the Most High because they didn't get a birthday cake. to blow out the candles on their fifth birthday. So they've been hating the Most High ever since. A lot of them go out here, run around here, steal some M&Ms out the Dollar General, and then get caught and thrown in jail by the police and blame the Most High because they got caught stealing some M&Ms at the Dollar General. That ain't got nothing to do with the Most High. That's you. Because he already told you, thou shalt not steal. Stop the craziness. Listen to this again. Further, non-chattel slavery was generally not organized by race, but by circumstance and economics. For example, foreigners, debtors, criminals, and so on. And if you look in with this the quote unquote slave laws in the book of Leviticus or Deuteronomy, if you look at it, right, what you'll see is it's only talking about how you deal with foreigners, how you deal with people that are in debt to you or who carry debt, criminals, and people who voluntarily go into servanthood as a profession to support their families or themselves. I broke this down on Chris' channel earlier. And they have to understand that during that time, there was really no concept of race. Race is a false construct. It's a false social construct that only came about by white folks in the 1600s. Race is a false social construct. I was just reading the other day about one of the greatest emperors of Rome was Septimus Severus, the person who they named the month of September after. He was a black African man. One of the greatest Roman emperors ever. And they say now, if you actually take a trip over into London or over into the UK, when you walk in their greatest museums or even some of their most hallowed halls, they pay tribute with a bust of this a statue of this black African emperor, Septimius Severus. And actually, in I believe in London right now, in England right now, somewhere in the UK, they still have the great barrier, a barrier structure, a wall that he built to keep his enemies out. And, over there in Rome. I'm sorry, not in England, in Rome. So, like, we have to understand that they didn't have a concept of race as we do it today. So this whole argument about comparing slavery in Israel to what we see today is a false equivalency. It's a bad argument. We're talking more about social order and social structure. Absolutely, Yerim Yahoo. This is attested to in the annals of history. But they won't make these arguments. They won't bring out this information because their whole point with these Garfield Reeds, Chris Harris's, Jabari's, their whole idea is to manipulate information because they got something against the Most High. I don't know what it is. But you got a personal vendetta. And it shows. Because the arguments you make are never based on fact. You manipulate, castigate, and insinuate false information. And you try to teach it to a people who will unexpectedly swallow this foolishness, because you guys know that unfortunately many people are just followers. They won't go and study and research the information for themselves. They're lazy scholastically. They're lazy, and they rather you do it because you feed along into their appeal to emotion. So y'all follow them blindly. You got to come out of that. You got to come out of that. To be clear, slavery in any sense perverts Yahweh's created intention for human beings. And there are some harsh passages we have to deal with. But there is a vast difference between the deplorable wickedness we see in a film like 12 Years a Slave and Emancipation, and say what Paul is addressing in the first century, especially in the book of Ephesians, for those who deal with the New Testament church, or Abraham's relationship with his top servant, right, in Genesis chapter 24 verse 2, dealing with Eleazar. And that's and Genesis chapter 24 verses 1 and 2 is a big dagger to this whole argument, because what we see Abraham clearly, who has a servant who's not an Israelite, he's a foreigner by the name of Eleazar. And if you read in the cultural context, what does Abraham say to Eleazar? As a matter of fact, what does Abraham say when he's given the prophecy that he's going to bear a son? He said, look, I've given up on that. I'm in my old age. I'm going to leave everything I have to my servant. And the Bible tells us that Abraham at his time, in his area, was one of the most wealthiest men ever. With land and riches. And he was going to leave that not to another not to another person from his own from his homeland where he was born. He didn't even say he was going to leave his riches to Lot, his nephew. He said, I'm going to leave it to my servant, Eleazar. Does that sound like shadow slavery? Does that sound like an institution that depresses a person or oppresses a person? It absolutely does not. And we see the same understanding by the time we get to Moses and the Exodus, and the Deuteronomy, and the Levitical laws. By the time we get there, we still see the same practice that Abraham was always practicing. Exactly, Yahoo. He's like a son. He becomes part of the family. When did you see that happening in the antebellum South? In the Americas. When did you see that happen? And this happens several times throughout the scriptures in the Old Testament. Shlaki. Where you have a father of the tribe of Judah who has daughters. And these daughters have no husbands. So what does he do? He has his Egyptian servant marry his daughters. So again, that's also another dagger to those who you talk about the Bible's anti-African. You have a man from the tribe of Judah who marries his daughters to his Egyptian servant, who's not an Israelite, not a Judite, he's an Egyptian. And he marries his daughter to the Egyptian. And what happens? So that his name can go on, so they can produce him sons. And what happens? The Egyptian and the Israelite woman, their children, what? Become of the tribe of Judah. Why? Because the grandfather was of the tribe of Judah. So they carry on the name. And they carry on the tribe and the law, statutes, and commandments of the Most High. So we clearly see this whole argument, even that the Bible is anti-African, is stupid. Like Yirmiyahu says in the chat, he becomes like a son. That's what I mean about these people don't understand the cultural context of what they're reading. They stuck on this word and they get all in a frenzy. Get their little G-strings all in a bunch because they read the word slave. And they try to appeal to your emotions. I'm going to do a part 2 here. Translation of the term slave. We need to know one Hebrew word, ibed, also translated as ived. It is commonly translated slave. The King James Version of the Bible had 2 occurrences of the word slave, once in each testament. The New King James Version in the 20th century had 46 occurrences. There has been a general increase over time in the use of the word slave in translations of the Bible into various languages. Right? Let's go here. Ebed is translated as slave in some cases and servant in others. Leviticus 25, verse 42. In the English RSV translation has slave once and servant once, but both translate the same word, ebed, or servant. And slave used to overlap much more in meaning, but now have different meanings. Servants are no longer seen as slaves. The meaning of the word ebed is not inherently negative, but relates to work. And this is what I was telling Chris Harris earlier on his show when he tried to bring this out as an argument. I was like, look, it's more, if you understand the cultural context, it has to do with more of an employee-employer relationship. That's what this is. It's what this is talking about. The word identifies someone as dependent on someone else with whom they stand in some sort of relation. Being a bed could be a position of honor. Everyone is a servant, slave, or slave of someone else. Now, it could be in a position of honor, and we see this with David, and I believe with Obed-Edom. It's the same definition, servant of Edom, Obed-Edom, where David rested the Ark of the Covenant in Obed-Edom's house. And then they had a position, a high position of honoring position in the temple. I believe as the doorkeeper at the temple. They weren't allowed to work in the temple during the Israelite custom and culture, but he was able to be a doorkeeper. And this is why we often used to hear the old folks say, "I'd just be glad to be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord." So we have to stop allowing these people to take these words, slave these, and make them trigger words for us and put that on the biblical narrative as if it means the same thing culturally. It does not. This is where they fail, and this is why I can say the Bible does not condone chattel slavery. It doesn't condone slavery. But what it does is it deals with the conditions of the times, the social order and social class of the times. This is what we're seeing being done among the ancient Israelites. The Bible clearly speaks about, about the institution of slavery. Listen, we were once oppressed and killed. We were slaves ourselves once. So why would we do that to another nation? This is one of the problems and arguments that I have against the One West teachers, the One West doctrine. When you talking about you're going to have Esau is going to be in slavery to you. These African nations going to be in slavery to us. Like, no, bro, the Bible don't teach that, bro. I don't care how you try to spin it. It doesn't teach that. Slavery in its institution is inherently evil, and the Bible and the Most High does not condone it nor support it. Let's go a little bit further. Leviticus 25, verse 42 through 44. It says, "For they are my servants, whom I bought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. They shall not be sold as slaves are sold." 43. "You shall not rule over them with harshness, but shall fear your God." Verse 44. "As for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves." What is it talking about here? It's talking about servants who you would have in servitude to you. Question: if this biblical reference to slavery is equivalent to chattel slavery, then why is Israel being forbidden not to make chattel slaves of themselves or for themselves? The answer is simply this. This is indentured voluntary servitude, employee-employer laws, not chattel slavery is understood in modern linguistics and social constructs of today. It's talking about a social order in how you do business. We have to get away from these false teachers, these Bible critics who are not honest about the information. They don't study the material culture. They don't study the linguistics. They don't study the language. It's all an appeal to emotion. Simple as that. The majority meaning of Ebed is servant, but can also be translated slave. It is not an inherently negative term. I think I just read that. Let me see. Yeah, no, again. The term shows the person is subservient to another. All subjects of Israel are servants of the king. Does that make them slaves? The king himself is a servant of their God. Is he a slave? So in the time of the Old Testament, no one is free. Everyone is subservient to an Ebed of someone else. There's a hierarchy. It's an honor. It's an honorary system of dealing with those over you. Some of us run our own business. If you have employees, that employee is subservient to you, is a servant to you, is an Ebed to you, is a slave to you. If you go to work and you punch a clock, you're a slave to that clock. but it deals with more of a context of an employee-employer relationship. We so triggered by the word. Translating embedded slave is problematic because of its negative connotations. Exactly. Which were not originally there, but we associated from other historical contexts. This generally leads to inconsistency in translation, and it becomes hard for readers not to read into the word ideas from subsequent, very different systems of slavery, as you see in Greece and Rome and North America. No matter how, because we've been so inundated with antebellum slave images from the Americas, 12 years of slave. Every year they come out with every year it seems like they come out with a new slave documentary or a new slave movie to remind us that we were slaves in this country. I ain't seen a slew of movies done on Black Wall Street yet. But they use it as a means of psychological warfare to remind you you're nothing but a slave. The Bible clearly speaks against this. The essence of the Old Testament institution. In the patriarchal system, the work in someone's household was carried out by herdsmen and domestic servants. But if Abraham had no offspring, one of his servants, this is what I was just talking about, would inherit all he had. Genesis chapter 15, verse 3. This is where you can read that. Servants were trusted with money and weapons. There is no approval for selling people, although Abraham acquired people for silver. In other words, oftentimes what you see happening in Israel, they were buying people out of destitute situations, people that were slaves in foreign countries that were being sold. Abraham and others in the biblical narratives we see oftentimes bought them out of that situation into a situation where they would have better chance of survival, of supporting themselves, enlisting, and becoming a part of a better social class. Listen, Lex Ward check. Hey, I hear you, bro. I hear you, Kofi. Let the dead bury the dead. That's where Lex shall remain. We put him out of his misery 2 years ago. Genesis chapter 15, verse 3. And Abraham said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Where they do that? Where they do that at? Other than in Israel. Show me where they did that in ancient Kemet. Show me where they did that among the Assyrians. Show me where they did that among the Babylonians. Show me where they did that among the Persians. Show me where they did that. That they would take a servant or an Ebed or a slave and make them an heir to everything that they worked their whole entire lives for. And give it to a servant. Abraham had family. He loved Lot, his nephew. But he says, I have no children. So a servant in my household will be my heir. This is the problem. They want to criticize the book without actually studying and going into the book. It's easy to arm yourselves against these clowns. Watch this. And I got to get out of here. Comparing slave systems. The following table shows a comparison of slave systems, conditions of slaves in different systems. In the Old Testament, in the Roman world, and in the New World, where we see shadow slavery existed here in Americas, right? And the Roman oppression. And let's compare these two greatest slave systems of slavery, the Romans and in the New World. Let's compare it to what we read and see in the Old Testament concerning the concerning the Israelites. So in the Old Testament, did they have a holiday? What was the holiday? What was the holiday? They had everybody joined in on the feast days. Everybody kept the feast days in Israel, including your servant. No work to be done on those days. Everybody kept the Shabbat. In Rome, no. You working 7 days a week. In the New World, I think they would give you would get one day off. I think they would get July 4th off is the day that the slaves would get off. I think they would have to work either a half a day or they would get the whole day off. They would have to celebrate the holiday of the American independence while under the oppression of white oppressors. That's a psychological trip for you. Did he get enough food in the Old Testament? Yes, you had to feed your servants. You had to allow them to eat. They ate what you ate. Did that happen with the Romans? No. Did that happen with in the New World with America, shadow slaves in America? No. What about legal redress? Did they have any legal recourse or legal rights for being wronged by an oppressor or a slave or their masters or their employers? In the Old Testament, yes, you had those rights, legal rights. With the Romans, no. In the Americas, no, you had no legal rights. What about sexual protection, sexual abuse against women who were servants or in servitudes? Did they have any protection against that among the Israelites? Yes. Rape was punishable by death. What about in Rome? No. What about in the New World? We don't have to even answer that. We know it didn't exist. What about those being kidnapped? I just read you the scripture. You couldn't man steal. Exodus chapters 21 through chapters 26. You couldn't kidnap a person. Did they do it in the Roman slave system? Yes. Did they do it in the antebellum South, bringing slaves over here to the Americas, kidnapping from the west coast of Africa? Hell yeah. What about binding people with chains? No, you couldn't do that. In the Roman slave system, the New World system, yes. What about torture? No, you couldn't torture your slave. Did the Romans torture you? Yes. Did they torture you here in the Americas? Yes. What about physical abuse? No, you could not physically abuse your servant or slave or any bed. You couldn't physically abuse them. Now, Chris Harris tried to go into the Levitical law and say, look, could you beat a servant? Yeah, you could beat him, but why? I asked him the question. Why were you allowed to beat a servant or a slave if he did something wrong, if he stole from you, if he broke a law? If he broke a law. That was a civil law that anybody could be condemned with. Even slave masters. Could be punished for abusing someone physically or sexually. Y'all out of here with this, man. Y'all got to stop with these fallacious arguments. You're never going to be able to prove this argument. Not outside of these fish bowls y'all debate on and platforms y'all debate on. Never going to be able to do it. Peace to you, DJ Black Charm. Salute to you, fam. One more slide, then I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna do a part 2 tomorrow. The Bible does not condone chattel slavery. I was let me go to this one. I think that's the end of this that's the end of this presentation. I'm gonna go on to the next one. I'm going to the next one. I'm gonna do part 2 tomorrow. We're gonna go into this whole thing and break down this whole institution and understanding of slavery in the Bible, what it's actually talking about and dealing with. You're going to really get into that and put some meat on this argument, because there's too many of these guys running around here making these extraordinary claims that they can't substantiate. I don't care whose name you throw out here, Kofi. You can't defend against this. The cultural context in terms of what we see in the Bible, in the Old Testament, deals with the social class and the social order. Simple as that. Simple as that. So, peace and blessings, family. I appreciate y'all, man, for coming in. Y'all tune in tomorrow, man. Y'all look for the notification. I'm definitely going to do a part 2 with this. I'm going to go through this entire lesson. I'm going to break it down, man, for the rest of the week. So y'all look for the notifications. I'm going to break it down. My job now is to arm others that are out there with information to go against these false arguments that you see out here in these YouTube streets. It's ridiculous. So definitely we're going to get into it. And again, peace and blessings to y'all, family. Y'all stick with me. I know I haven't been on for a while, but we definitely going to get it. Definitely going to get this thing together. It won't be as busy as I've been, but we're definitely going to get into it. Peace.